I was 56 when I agreed to spend my final full season as a volunteer wilderness ranger in the North Cascades, and I accepted the assignment because I wanted one last year in the mountains before retirement, not because I was chasing excitement. I'd worked 3 decades as a civil engineer in Western Washington and spent nearly every vacation backpacking, eventually earning enough backcountry experience that the park brought me on each summer to assist with trail patrols, campsite inspections, and visitor contacts in areas where permanent staff couldn't be everywhere at once. The district paired me with a small patrol cabin overlooking a junction where 3 remote trails crossed through old-growth forest beneath granite peaks. It wasn't a fire lookout. It sat low in the timber, surrounded by cedar, hemlock, and steep slopes that blocked radio coverage except during narrow windows each morning and evening when a portable antenna could reach a relay farther south. My job lasted 6 days. Every afternoon I checked permits, cleaned the composting toilet, recorded wildlife observations, updated trail condition boards, and logged anything unusual for the ranger hiking in after me the following week. Most entries were predictable: washed-out switchbacks, bear sightings, hikers with damaged boots, the occasional forgotten trekking pole. The strange part of the week didn't begin with a person. It began with paperwork. On my first evening, I unlocked the steel box holding campsite permits collected from visitors leaving the wilderness. Every permit matched expected routes, except one. A family of 4 had exited the previous morning according to their signed permit, yet the same permit number appeared again in that day's collection with different handwriting and a different exit date. I assumed someone had accidentally copied the wrong number onto a replacement form. Administrative mistakes happen. I clipped both permits together and made a note for headquarters. The next day I met 2 backpackers heading north. They asked whether trail crews were working near Alder Basin because they'd heard chainsaws shortly after sunrise. That caught my attention because chainsaws aren't permitted in designated wilderness without specific authorization, and no crews were scheduled anywhere near Alder Basin. Wind sometimes carries sound strangely through valleys, so I thanked them, marked the report, and continued patrol. When I reached the basin that afternoon, I found no workers, no cut logs, and no fresh sawdust. Instead, I found tire marks. Not vehicle tracks, those would have been impossible that deep into the wilderness, but narrow impressions from a heavy game cart or hand wagon crossing a muddy section of trail where no wheeled equipment should have been. The marks continued only 50 yards before disappearing across exposed rock. They were fresh enough that water still glistened inside the compressed mud. I photographed them beside my ruler and continued to patrol without following off trail. Regulations exist for a reason, and wandering into dense forest without support because of ambiguous evidence isn't one of them. Back at the cabin, I made my evening radio contact. The transmission broke twice before dispatch confirmed that no authorized maintenance crews had entered Alder Basin. They asked me to revisit the area the following day if time allowed. Overnight, heavy rain rolled across the range. Water drummed against the cabin roof until nearly dawn, washing away loose soil and filling every creek. The weather delayed several hiking parties, so my morning was spent helping reroute visitors around a damaged footbridge. One older couple mentioned passing a man wearing an orange safety vest farther down the trail. They assumed he worked for the park because he carried a clipboard. That description didn't fit anyone assigned to our district. Seasonal staff wore green or gray uniforms. Contractors displayed identification. Volunteers carried visible badges. An orange vest and clipboard sounded convincing enough to visitors who expected to see workers, but it wasn't standard for anyone operating there. I asked where they'd seen him. They pointed toward an abandoned stock trail closed nearly 10 years earlier after repeated landslides. By the time I reached that junction, the rain had started again. The old trail remained blocked by official closure signs and cable barriers. Someone had moved one barrier just enough for a person to slip through before setting it back into place. The mud beyond showed recent boot prints heading downhill. I called dispatch from the only ridge where the radio occasionally worked. Static swallowed half my report. The reply came through in fragments. Law enforcement, tomorrow, avoid contact alone. The signal vanished before I could ask questions. With weather closing in and daylight already fading beneath thick clouds, I returned to the patrol cabin instead of continuing after the tracks. Looking back, that decision probably kept me from walking into something I couldn't have handled. During the night, the rain finally stopped. Silence settled over the forest in that peculiar way it does after storms, when dripping branches become louder than wind. Around 3 in the morning, I woke because the cabin generator, which normally cycled every hour to maintain battery charge, hadn't started. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside, expecting another clogged fuel line. The generator door stood open. I was certain I'd latched it before bed, because checking fuel levels was part of my nightly routine. Nothing appeared stolen. The fuel can remained in place. Spare oil sat untouched. Only one thing had changed. My maintenance logbook lay on top of the generator housing instead of inside the cabin where I'd left it. It had been opened to the page containing my notes about the duplicate permit number and the wheel tracks near Older Basin. I didn't examine the area with my flashlight for long. Instead, I closed the generator, took the logbook inside, secured every window, and waited for daylight. At first light, I inspected the ground. The rain had left the soil soft enough to hold impressions clearly. I found my own boot prints from the previous evening and another set made by lightweight hiking shoes with worn heels. Whoever walked there had avoided the gravel whenever possible, stepping along wooden edging and exposed roots where tracks would disappear. That wasn't luck, it suggested experience. The prints ended at the service footpath leading away from the cabin toward the closed stock trail. I reported everything during the morning radio window. This time, dispatch answered immediately and told me 2 permanent rangers were hiking toward my location from opposite directions because another incident had developed overnight. A maintenance cache nearly 8 miles away had been entered without force damage. Nothing expensive had been taken. Instead, someone had photographed maps stored inside waterproof tubes. While waiting for the rangers, I hiked only as far as the permit collection box at the trail junction. Inside sat 3 new permits. 2 belonged to hikers I had personally spoken with the previous afternoon. The third used the same permit number as the duplicated form from my first evening, but every field was different again. Different names, different group size, different destination. The handwriting matched neither of the earlier versions. Whoever kept submitting those forms wasn't trying to enter the wilderness legally. They were creating confusion in the record of who had been where and when. When Rangers Molina and Everett arrived just after noon, we began reconstructing the previous week's visitor movements instead of chasing footprints. That decision changed everything. Comparing permit copies stored at trailheads with carbon duplicates already transmitted to headquarters, we found at least 11 altered permits spread across 4 remote entry points. Some listed campsites that didn't exist. Others moved hikers onto trails they had never used. On paper, it looked like dozens of people had wandered unpredictably through the backcountry. In reality, almost everyone had followed their planned routes. The false paperwork made it nearly impossible to determine who actually belonged in isolated areas on any given day. That mattered because law enforcement had already been investigating reports of valuable climbing equipment disappearing from unattended camps over the previous 2 seasons. The thefts appeared random until the permit discrepancies surfaced. Someone had learned that rangers relied heavily on permit records to estimate where legitimate visitors should be. By quietly introducing false permits, they created believable reasons for unfamiliar people to appear almost anywhere in the wilderness without attracting immediate attention. If questioned, they could simply claim another ranger had issued replacement paperwork after weather damaged the original. We spent the remainder of the day checking every backcountry registration box within hiking distance. At one forgotten trailhead accessible by an old forest road outside the park boundary, we found the missing link. Hidden beneath the permit forms was a laminated reference sheet listing ranger cabin locations, seasonal staffing dates, emergency radio windows, and notes just describing which volunteer rangers usually worked alone. The sheet looked like it had been assembled gradually over several years. My own cabin appeared only as a handwritten addition near the bottom margin. That evening, law enforcement expanded the search beyond park boundaries. Over the next week, they recovered several caches of stolen outdoor equipment concealed in abandoned mining structures inside neighboring national forest land. Some suspects were eventually identified through unrelated property crime investigations, but proving who had altered specific permits proved much harder. The paperwork itself had passed through too many hands. Officially, the case was considered solved because the theft ring was dismantled and the stolen equipment largely recovered. The report credited careful permit auditing with exposing the pattern. I believed that conclusion only partly explained what happened. Before leaving for the season, I packed my gear, swept the patrol cabin, shut down the generator, and completed the final inventory. As I removed my notes from the logbook, one folded sheet slipped from between the pages. It wasn't mine. It wasn't part of the official forms either. Someone had copied by hand the maintenance schedule for every remote patrol cabin in our district for the following summer, including the names of volunteers who had already been tentatively assigned. Those names had never been publicly released. It was a statement that ran to spend infection nowhere. I turned the paper over expecting another clue, but there was nothing on the back except a penciled checkmark beside my own cabin, as though whoever had been studying the stations had finished with that location and simply moved on to the next one. I was 31, a former Army communications technician before I joined the Forest Service, and the reason I ended up at the Dry Mesa Desert Contact Station inside a remote section of southern Utah wasn't because I wanted to patrol trails. I was there because I understood radios, repeaters, and the strange ways equipment failed in canyon country. The contact station itself was much more than a concrete office, a maintenance garage, 2 fuel tanks, a weather mast, and a small bunkroom sitting nearly 40 miles from the nearest paved highway. During October, the tourist season had almost disappeared, leaving long stretches where the only people I spoke to were volunteer campground hosts checking in by radio. The district had already been dealing with intermittent communication failures for several weeks. Dispatch blamed atmospheric conditions, but the outages never matched weather reports. They happened in narrow windows, almost always between 4:30 and 6 in the afternoon, and always affected only our district. My assignment was to spend 4 days logging every interruption while inspecting repeater batteries along old service roads. The first afternoon looked ordinary until one transmission cut through the static with perfect clarity. A calm male voice identified himself as Ranger Holden and requested confirmation that Road 12 had reopened after flood repairs. The problem was that Ranger Holden had retired 3 years earlier. I recognized the name because half the communication cabinets in the district still carried handwritten labels with his initials. Before I could answer, the signal disappeared into static again. Dispatch never acknowledged hearing it. I checked the equipment logs, assuming someone had reused his old call sign by mistake, but nobody had. It bothered me enough that I replayed the digital recording later that evening. The voice sounded relaxed, familiar with radio procedure, and completely unconcerned. There was no panic, no urgency, just a routine request about a road closure that had actually ended months earlier. The next morning I drove north to inspect repeater Site 7, climbing a rough track that twisted between sandstone ridges and dry washes. The battery bank looked fine, solar panels were clean, wiring showed no damage from rodents. I documented voltages, tightened one loose grounding bolt, and started back toward the station. About 5 miles down the hill, I found a pickup parked beside an unsigned maintenance spot. It wasn't unusual for utility contractors to stop along these roads, but this truck displayed no government markings, no contractor decals, and no license plate on the rear. Dust covered the tailgate evenly, except for a clean rectangle where a plate had obviously been removed recently. I checked for occupants. Nobody answered. Through the window I saw surveying stakes, bottled water, a folded topographic map, and a hard hat with no company logo. None of those items proved anything, Yet together they felt strangely incomplete, as though someone wanted the truck to resemble a work vehicle without identifying who actually owned it. I photographed the vehicle and reported it once I reached better radio coverage. Dispatch asked me to note the location until a law enforcement ranger could investigate later that day. By the time they arrived, the truck was gone. Only compressed tire impressions remained in the soft dirt. That evening, the communication outage returned at exactly 4:38. Instead of random static, every frequency carried short bursts of carrier signal without speech, almost like someone repeatedly pressing a transmit button and releasing it. Then the same voice came back. "Road 12 clear." A pause followed. "Anyone copy?" This time I answered before thinking. I identified myself and asked his location. Silence lasted nearly 10 seconds. Then another voice, younger and unfamiliar, said quietly, "Wrong station," before the transmission ended. I checked recording levels, frequencies, timestamps, everything I could think of. Nothing explained why an unidentified radio was reaching our system only during those narrow windows. The district communications supervisor drove out the following morning. We tested handhelds, vehicle radios, antenna cables, emergency backup equipment, even portable repeaters. Every system passed inspection. He suggested that distant atmospheric skip conditions occasionally carried transmissions hundreds of miles, but that theory fell apart because the signal strength remained consistent each time, and the voices referred to local roads by name. After he left, I updated the permit board outside the office, replaced faded trail notices, and walked around the fuel tanks during a routine safety inspection. Behind the storage container, I noticed fresh footprints crossing an area of wind-blown sand. They weren't heading toward the building. They were facing away from it. Someone had stood there long enough to leave deep impressions while looking directly at the station windows. No corresponding approach tracks existed because the ground beyond the footprints was solid rock. A gust of wind erased part of one print while I examined it. I measured the remaining length with a folding ruler anyway and entered it into my notebook more out of habit than expectation. That afternoon, the outage began 5 minutes earlier than usual. This time, dispatch disappeared completely. The station sounded isolated in a way that's hard to explain unless you've worked remote radio duty. Normally, there's always distant chatter somewhere. Fire crews, maintenance trucks, neighboring districts. Instead, every speaker sat quiet, except for occasional bursts of static. Then I heard vehicle doors closing outside. Not one, two. I looked through the office blinds toward the parking area. No vehicles. The sound came again, farther behind the maintenance garage. I walked out carrying only the handheld radio because department policy discouraged escalating uncertain situations. Behind the garage, I found fresh tire tracks leading toward an old utility corridor, closed after flash floods years earlier. The universe began to find with more and exodus. Economically, dispatch apologized for missing my earlier check-in, insisting they had called repeatedly. Their logs showed multiple unanswered transmissions from my station. My recorder contained none of them. The law enforcement ranger reached me just before sunset, and together we followed the utility corridor. After nearly 3 miles, we found an abandoned drilling pad left from decades-old mineral surveys. Hidden beside collapsed equipment sat a portable radio repeater powered by marine batteries and connected to a directional antenna aimed directly toward our district headquarters. It wasn't sophisticated enough to hack government communications, but it could overwhelm local frequencies during certain conditions, creating exactly the kind of intermittent outages we'd experienced. Someone had built the system using commercially available components painted desert tan to blend into the landscape. The batteries were still warm. Whoever installed it had left minutes before we arrived. Nearby, we discovered folding chairs, food containers, binoculars, and a notebook filled with handwritten observations. The entries didn't mention government secrets or military activity. They listed ranger routines, fuel deliveries, shift changes, volunteer schedules, which stations usually had one employee after summer ended, which patrol vehicles left it, but the selfishest fuse, one page, included my own truck number. Side the note, checks repeater first. There were no names attached to the observations. Fingerprints recovered later proved unusable because everything had been wiped clean. Investigators believed a group had been monitoring isolated public employees for reasons that were never fully established. Some suspected they were scouting remote infrastructure for theft. Others thought they were using closed government roads to move stolen equipment while disrupting communications whenever rangers drew too close. The official report settled on attempted interference with federal communications, though no arrests followed. Months later, the repeater site was dismantled, and the utility corridor permanently blocked with large boulders. That should have ended the story. It almost did. The following spring, a volunteer restoring archived radio recordings called me because he found something odd while cataloging files from the previous autumn. One transmission, recorded 2 weeks before my assignment even began, contained the same calm voice asking whether Road 12 had reopened. At the end of that recording, barely audible beneath static, another person answered with a sentence no one had noticed before. Not yet. He's still working alone tomorrow.